I was painting by the time I was 10, using my mother's paint. But like many, many women, I had children and went to work as a single parent and had to give up being an artist until those children were grown and basically on their own. And so I went off to start being a painter and suddenly became the parent to my grandchild, who luckily is as creative as I am, so she's willing to come along with me as I am being an artist. So I am a painter. I'm also a mixed media artist. This is actually my installation and my paintings. Back here I also have a show up on mixed media art currently at the Britannia Gallery. I also do teaching and curating. And I'm also currently beginning, which is pertinent to this topic, with a whole group of women, there's about 100 of us now, beginning an organization in Vancouver that is designed to promote and support women in the arts, specifically because of what you're going to hear tonight about what happens for women who go into the creative fields. Unfortunately, one of the things that is true is that we do have labor laws and things about gender discrimination, but they haven't quite filtered into areas where creativity is a part of that. And so any creative field has a lot of gender discrimination that happens, and that is particularly true when it comes to fine arts. So what I thought I would do today is to just lay some groundwork so you understand why we're here. Historically, women have not had the same rights and privileges as men. I don't have to support that with any stats because we all know that that's true. It's been true about the vote in our own bodies. It's true about owning land. So it's no surprise that we're here talking about gender differences when it comes to women artists in the 21st century. Canada still ranks 12th in the world for a gender gap when it comes to wages. That's even more true when you look at women artists. According to the Guerrilla Girls, and for those of you who don't know, the Guerrilla Girls are the sort of radical group of women who started out in the 70s, and they're most known for donning guerrilla suits and putting up big posters about how unfair the art world is to women. But they do other things, and one of the things that they've done is create some research. And what they have found is that white male artists still make 80 to 90% more than women artists and artists of color. In Canada, we have an organization called Hills Strategies Incorporated who produce the Arts Research Monitor, and they do surveys and develop stats around the art industry. And what they have found is that their stats actually concur with what the Guerrilla Girls stats say. Because that ratio is so outrageous, it's highly unlikely that it's because men are better artists. And more likely that the art world is structured to perceive that art made by men as more valuable and credible than the art that's made by women. It's a false construct. That said, beliefs are very, very powerful, and everybody here can come up with somewhere in their lives where they've had a belief that made them believe something that they didn't have necessarily any proof about. Beliefs are powerful, and they can have an actual effect on the investment value of art. So, for instance, the art made by men, because the arts world structure and these types of constructs will be perceived as more valuable and therefore will be purchased for more money, making them truly more valuable than the work made by women. So most female artists are not benefiting from this type of perception. An artist's average earnings are well below the general labor force by 74%. And that stat is important when you start to look at the fact that women make up 53% of the artists, but they make 69% of what men earn. So in the same way that in the general labor force, women make 76 cents to every man's dollar, in the art world, and that's an average, women are making 69% of what men are In 1971, 40% of the artists in Canada were women, but by 2001, 30 years later, that had grown to 54%, and it was based on a much larger number. I teach classes, I've been to numerous workshops, I've talked to other people who run workshops, and the majority of the people who are in our classes and in our groups are women. Usually they're all women. Usually they're all women and one guy. It's very rare to have more than one man in my classes. So just to keep going, I don't want to bore you with a lot of this, but I want to give you a good understanding of why we're here. When we compare artists by sex and occupation, and I've narrowed it down, this is from StatsCan, so these are Canadian stats. When we look at artisans and craftsperson, and I included that because a lot of women's artwork is sometimes considered craft rather than fine art, 62% of those artists are women. So that's an up from the 53%. So I'm narrowing down those original stats down to two very specific groups, artisans and craftspeople, and painters, sculptors, and visual artists, which are more commonly called fine artists. So 62% of artisans and craftspeople are women, and 54% of painters, sculptors, and other visual artists are women. But when you look at their earnings, artisans and craftspeople, women artisans and craftspeople make 55% of what men do. That's down from that 69% I talked about before. And painters, sculptors, and fine artists, women make 56% of what men do. So, before we all became artists, I don't know how many artists are here in the room actually, most of us went to school, and we entered school with a lot of hope and dreams, and believing that that post-secondary education was going to lead to a much more well-established art career. That is nothing further than the truth for artists. In fact, post-secondary education does not translate into higher sales or more prestige or more standing in the art world. What is also true is that in Canada, women, there are twice as many women going to art school than men. So and that was true from 2005 to 2009. So for instance, there were almost 14,500 men, but there was 27,500 women. Okay, so twice as many. So remember that figure when I get a little bit farther down. So a guy by the name of Nicholas Forrest, he's an art market analyst and an art critic and a journalist, and he recently did some of his own sort of legwork, and in 2007, he published in the New York Magazine some of those figures. And what he found was that only 15% of the artists whose work was shown in the permanent collection of the Whitney Museum of American Art, that's a big museum for artists, were female. So 15% of the artists in that museum were women. In 2007, the Venice Biennale had stats where 76 were male and 24% were female artists, and those stats were replicated almost to the same percentage for the Art Basel Miami Beach setting. And worse, something called the Frick Collection, which I don't even know what that is. Do you know what that is? The Frick Collection, you do?
I do too.
They had a mere 1% female artists. So I started looking at other things. I wanted to see sort of in terms of how far did this go when we talked about really famous artists. Never mind just the folks, who are still trying to make it. What about the really famous ones? So I looked at the most expensive painting ever bought and sold. And it's Lucian Freud's. It's an infamous painting called Big Sue, and it sold for $33.6 million. Okay? That would be nice if Lucian Freud got it, but I can quite concur that he did not get that. Somebody who collected it got it. In comparison, the most expensive female painting was a woman by the name of Marlene Dumas, and I'm terrified to tell you that I don't even know who this person is. Have you ever heard her?
Marlene
Really?
Dumas is a well-known painter.
There, see, why don't I know that?
Where does she come from?
I went to art school. I should know that, right?
But she's an artist from the 90s. She's an artist from the 90s
I should
and the
still,
early 21st century.
still know
country?
that name.
She's English.
She's English.
Yeah.
Okay. So the most expensive female painting sold for 6.4 million, which is 5 times less than the man's painting. Okay. So in 2006, 23% of the solo exhibitions in the New York City art galleries, all the art galleries, were women. So they only comprised of 23%. Many museum collections have a 5 to 10% amount of women artists in them. The rest are men. And in fact, it's kind of a sort of a standard ratio that even though 80% of the students going through art schools and institutions are female, 80% of the artists in galleries and museums are men. Okay? So there's something really odd going on. It's really highly unusual, one, that we're getting the same stats in Canada that they're producing in the United States, that we're getting the same stats from an organization called Guerrilla Girls that we're getting from some white guy who runs Hill Strategies in Ottawa, Canada. And it seems to me that what we're dealing with is a social construct that has very entrenched ideas about who makes art that is valuable. And I suspect that it goes right back to Victorian times when women were meant, they were obligated to learn about painting and singing and playing the piano and sewing as a part of learning to be a good wife and a good mother. Whereas men who wanted to learn how to paint were expected to learn how to paint because that was going to be their career. And those two things never went across, very rarely. And so as Graham was saying, I think that what that points to is the fact that women's voices and artists are those voices. We are the voices of society. We talk about the things that are happening in our world. Those voices are being silenced by a construct that is socially created and not supported by the artwork itself.